PowerPoint and the video. So as long as it works, let's see if we can keep with this format. As Ritesh said, I'm going to start with very quick responses to some of the questions. Again, like in the previous sessions, we have had some questions which will be taken up in the other sessions, because as I said, I am going to cover the question of religion and education, science education separately. So we have a long time to discuss that. But some of those which connect to what we have spoken earlier and what we will be speaking today, what we'll be discussing today, let me highlight some of those questions. So to just very quickly run through these questions, there were a couple of questions on the relationship between scientific method to concerns of philosophy. And as we said, that point is always which we have to expect when we look at science, because science originates from philosophy in some sense. And the tension between the child and the parent is very much inherent in the tension between science and philosophy. So is the question of the method itself something which is just a philosophical question? Or is it just an ideological question for scientists? Or is it that the method becomes so much a part of the practice that, we don't really learn method? Just like, as I said, something very interesting we should remember, at least till recent times, science students never did a course on logic, and they also didn't do a course on method. They didn't have to do a course on method like it's so important for social science students. So in some sense, yes, one could ask what kind of self-awareness of the idea of method, whether it's really important for scientific practice or not. And that was also related to the question between mathematical reasoning and science reasoning. And yes, philosophy does indeed mediate this, because philosophy's fundamental task here is to reflect on what you mean by what you mean by science, what you mean by mathematics, why do some things work, and so on. So one can see that the background question of philosophy hovering around the idea of method repeatedly. And the questions in science education, again, many of them came back to the questions of what is it to teach science. And as I said earlier, and this is something which all of you know very well as science educationists, the debate between teaching content of science or the nature of science or processes of science. So hopefully, I think the question was also that if we are looking at practices of science, is that very useful in teaching science education? And I definitely think that's an extremely important part, but it becomes more difficult to teach it. It's much easier to teach an ideal scientific method, much more than going into the complexity of individual behavior, individual histories, and social standing in the doing of science. So maybe that's one of the reasons that this is always. I'll come back to the question of one aspect of science teaching today. And another person also asked an interesting question: why in philosophy, instead of accepting a conclusion, all philosophers generally, when they talk, they say this philosopher said that, that philosopher said that, without letting the statement stand for itself. And that is really something which I deeply agree with. I have a slide on looking at what is the nature of philosophical knowledge. I'll come back to it. I think it's a serious problem in our understanding of what philosophy is. There are also questions about the question of language and the scientific capability in India. And that again, I'll come back to later. There is a comment that scientific research is always changes as society changes in various ways. So what is special to my discussion of artificial intelligence and showing how the new science is being modified? I totally agree with it. In fact, the symbiotic relationship between science and society is what we are talking about. We know that much of science has been driven by not early ideas of science, discovering knowledge about the universe, staring in awe at the universe and the skies and so on, but it's also been driven by defense interests, war efforts, various issues related to communication, commercial interests, and so on. So there's nothing wrong in saying that science gets modified, but what we have to ask is, in this modification, what is happening to our modification of the ideas of science, scientific knowledge, scientific method, and so on. So then when people still hold on to very ideal, old ideas of science, then that becomes potentially a problem. And there are related questions on the relation between science and social science, and the question about movement from data to theory, etc. I'm going to address that much more today. So that's going to be the major part of my discussion. So I'll skip those questions which were related to, science, social science. Also a question about other aspects of knowing, why I have not addressed things like spirituality and so on. We'll come back to that today. And the question which somebody asked, can we still understand science as a monolithic time invariant process? The simple answer to that is no. Hopefully yesterday's discussion or day before's discussion would have given us some idea on how to say this, rather than saying it as a critique of science, but rather to understand the complexity of science, the much of it driven through an extremely interesting relationship between social processes and scientific practice as a social process. There are and I think the question about, there was a question purely from science, philosophy question, which was, what is the analytical philosophy, continental philosophy divide, influence philosophy of science? That's a completely different topic, but just a very quick point for the person who asked this question. You'd be very interested to know that in the 19th century, there was a movement called scientific philosophy, of which, all the famous, phenomenology, I mean, the continental tradition, were all part of it, like the early Heidegger. And there was an attempt to try and rethink of making philosophy scientific in some sense. And then they split away with different preoccupations. But that's a completely different story in philosophy, which we cannot get into now, but we can continue the conversation later. There is also some questions in Hindi, with how best I could understand them. I think the question the person was asking is, why is even science seen in association with other disciplines like home science, social science, etc.? Because if it is just a study of natural phenomena, why does it get connected to other phenomena described by these disciplines? And I think that's an extremely important point, and that's what we've been really talking about, why people use the word science. When they attach the word science to home science or social science or sports science or whatever science, then it's not that they are using Newton's laws of motion to, analyze how a person is running. What they are doing is invoking ideas of scientific method, notions of scientific knowledge, and many of these aspects related in this larger universe of science. They're also using it like a rhetorical discourse, because science has got value in a society. If you want funding, the chance of you getting it under the name science is much more than if you called it philosophy or arts or literature or something like that. So definitely there are these many factors which influence this, and that rhetoric and ideology, we should remember that earlier on, including up to the time, including in Newton's time, it was religion which had this role. So if you wanted social prestige and social support and social patronage, you would have probably addressed some of these disciplines in terms of the connection, making it connected to religion. And there's a very, very interesting debate with Newton and Newton's own utterances about theology, and his own, including his claim that the success of his physics shows the existence of God. It was, in a sense, trying to reconcile the power of religious institutions at that time in England with the practice and the growth of a new discipline called science. So, this is really about how we understand social power and how important patronage is to many of these activities like science, arts, and so on. And finally, there's a question also sent in by Gmail. It's an interesting question about aesthetics in science, because this person points out that a lot of scientists use terms like beauty and other terms when you're talking about science. And this is a fascinating field. There's quite a lot of work in this. And I can send you, that person writes to me, I can send some, references. This is actually very interesting, because the reason why this becomes so powerful in the imagination of science is the association of truth with beauty. And it says a lot about the nature of truth itself, and also what we call as beauty. There have been very wonderful instances of how both theoreticians and experimentalists have chosen to believe in a structure of science because they felt it was beautiful as compared to a messy science. So this association goes back to early Greek ideas of harmony, and so on. Anyway, we won't get into that, but there is actually a large amount of it. But then the real question which a scientist would ask is, maybe a scientist might appreciate something as saying, oh, this is beautiful, not beautiful, but does it really add to scientific epistemology? In other words, it may influence a scientist in doing something, it's an idea, but does it really matter when it is used to justify? Can it justify the knowledge claim and the truth values of science? Okay, so this is I think a good entry into what I want to talk about today. Extending much of what we were speaking yesterday, the last 3 sessions, I'm building all those 3 lectures to this particular lecture, flowing down to making certain comments about the nature of social science. And what does it mean to talk about 2 things? 1, what does it mean to talk about social science? And 2, and again, all the correlated subjects around social science. So it could be education as part of that. It is also about religious studies, science studies, many of the disciplines, other than the standard ones of economics, sociology, anthropology, etc. So I want to look at, if we understand questions of science, the practices of science as we have seen, and the ideas of scientific method, what does it say about the ideas of social science? How do we meaningfully think through this? As I said, I don't want to take positions here. I want to think through it so we understand it together on what is this thing called social science, what is special to it, can we just borrow science directly into it, etc. And 2, I also want to understand this in the context of a scientific study of society. When people try and say that doing science will give you the capacity to understand the world rationally, the debate which has been about the fact that if you had scientific temper, which presumably is doing more of science or thinking like scientists, would help us deal with various social injustices related to caste and gender and class and so on. These kinds of questions, some of which we will take up when I do Marxism and science. So what kind of foundations for such arguments can we have? I'm not going to enter into that debate at all, but I just want to focus on the point which I ended with last time, which is that, yes, there is an ideal model of science, which comes with certain preoccupations in the early science, like we saw with Bacon, Galileo, and all these people, Newton, and so on. But there is also something called practice of science. And why does the question of practice of science become important? Because science has grown so much that it is no longer just some person sitting and doing something with 10 students and others around him or her. It has become far more, as we saw, if you are having 7,000 papers being published and millions of papers being produced every year. It is very important, therefore, to look at the practice of science. And the kinds of questions I want to raise in the practice of science are actually quite simple. One second. Okay. So I want to start to understand everyday science because it's related to the kind of social value which scientists have. Now, we know that, as I've been saying, that there has been, I think, very appreciable amount of say of the scientific community in India, although many scientists might disagree with this. I'm saying this particularly in the context of other communities, which it will help them understand this, particularly in the context of other communities, whether within academics or outside academics, perhaps except religion. And there's actually a lot of very interesting overlap between science and religion in the way, not in what they are doing. A great overlap in science and religion historically also has been in their institutional structures, both of them as social institutions exerting power on the society in very different ways, both with the so-called common people as well as with the powerful rulers, the patrons, the people who govern a society. So there's a very interesting connection between the two. And this is just an aside. I don't want to read too much into it, but I think it is not an accident that in India, the two disciplines which have not grown and which I think is impossible to start in any Indian institution, although it is started in every other country around the world, The two of them are science studies, and the second one is religious studies. You can't start both of them because of the kind, I mean, it actually reflects the kind of the powers which are there, the conflict, the people who feel that they are the ones who should talk about science, and the people in certain forms of religion who feel they are the only ones who can talk about religion, and so on. So I think it's worth keeping in the back of the mind without reading too much into it. But these are the kind of social processes that social scientists should be interested in. The point I'm trying to make here is when a large number of scientists invoke the idea of scientific temper or say, look, be scientific, and so on, many times when they say that, they are talking about it as if they're representation of science, but really, is it from the kind of work, the day-to-day rationality, or is it from the value derived of science done by others? Or that is the ideal, the rationality present in ideal models of science. So this may sound like a polemical question, and I'm not trying to be polemical here. I'm opening up. I mean, it's been difficult to even ask these questions in the public, so I'm saying it now, which is to ask whether all scientists practice scientific method in their work every day. So I think it's important to recognize, to understand what is it that they do every day in the doing of science. It's like what somebody comes and asks me, what do you do as philosophy? If you're being paid for philosophy, what do you do every day? That's something I often ask my colleagues, we're all getting paid so much. What do you think we're supposed to do every day? Because you're being paid every day. It's not that some days you work, you get paid and you don't get paid. What is this idea of doing science, of doing philosophy, of doing social science, and etc.? So again, as a more critical reflection, you can ask, is every step of their thought logical? Are they very logical? They do science itself all the time? Are they very logical in their daily lives, in their opinions about society? Because they have opinions, like we have opinions. I don't have to be an educationist to have an opinion on education. And I think, that's valid, just like scientists don't have to be educationists to have opinion on education. But as educationists who have really studied the subject, like scientists have studied their subject, at least I would listen to you. If you tell me, look, you're talking nonsense, you don't know anything about education, you're just spouting something off, I will listen to you because I think you are the one who has done work in that, who knows things about it, right? Or at least we will have a discussion about it. But is that really happening in the context of science? Is the value given to science as an activity? Does it, through a process of osmosis, enters into all their opinions as if they are all scientific, as if they are being very reflective opinions? So it's worth thinking, asking, what do scientists do when they do science? And this is just you can see this as an anthropological account, if you like, because I've always been within science communities, both as a student and later on also, and also within my work profession within at the National Institute of Advanced Studies. We're surrounded by science institutes and studying science institutes. So these are, when I'm giving this list of what they do when they're doing science, this is entirely like, a kind of an anthropological account, a kind of an ethnographic account of watching what they do and also having done part of that kind of a practice. So what is everyday science? So I want to give you some broad contours of it. It's far more complex, of course. There are many more things people do in different disciplines, where people do different things. But if you look at it largely in terms of something called theory and something called experiment, that there are people who work on theory within all the different fields, physics, chemistry, biology, etc. Some people who work on experiments, and people who work on experiments have labs to go to. They'll have typically they'll have much larger number of students than people who are doing theory. And theory still remains a kind of a singular process, a person who's sitting and thinking in their office and writing something, doing something. And the collaborative work which is happening in experiment is very obvious, because these are experimental apparatus built and run, and you have enormous number of people making observations. It's not all the time they're just a simple act of sitting in a lab and watching and hearing the machine run, taking down some notations, or observations sometimes. It's a long process, and people take years, as you know, to do students to do PhD in physics, in theory and experiments, just like in other academic disciplines. So typically, just to give you a quick idea of the kinds of things which they do, and I'm bringing this to the attention of social scientists. So I'm talking about it as a social scientist, how do we address this question, okay? So I'm sure as many scientists who are here in the group or people who are scientists around us, they know this is what they do in their daily lives. So theoretically, what do you do? It's not that every day you're coming up with new theories, although there are so many of these papers being published. It's not very rarely that you have these paradigmatic jumps. Yesterday's question on Kuhn was illustrative of that. About the idea of paradigmatic jumps, sudden jumps and great ideas which come in, and then after that there is a period in which a lot of people work around it, strengthening that theory or showing it to be right or wrong, etc. So this old idea that scientists are like bees who are, so there are these two images, right? One, theorists are like spiders sitting in a corner spinning their own web and not really caring about other things, and experimenters are like ants busily running around all the time doing something. Okay, but then the idea that scientists are more like bees in that they are very busily going around picking up nectar and doing things, but yet you take all that stuff which you do and then digest it and create nectar or honey, which is like the nectar. So this creation of value is in the honey which is created out of all this collection of this hard work of many people bringing various things. But that moment of digestion, that theoretical reflection, it's an interesting model. Just keep it in the back of our mind. But so there are people, when they do theory, they're working with models alone, and it may be nothing to do with the real world, because that's the way scientific theories are largely built. You solve some equations, you do some computer simulations. There are these kinds of so-called theoretical non-experimental work has expanded so much, but you do it. And it's not that you do it all the time. Obviously in a month, it's not like every moment you're sitting in your office, you're doing this. You go to lectures, you talk to students, you have a lot of tea. For some reason, all science institutes love to have places where they have tea and coffee, and you just sit and talk. And you don't talk all the time about science. You talk about sports and politics and stuff like that. So it happens in a very, very different kind of a discursive universe. It's not about all the time this question of logic and rationality functioning in each moment of their thinking. As we saw yesterday, the difference between scientific thinking and others is that in the final results, in the legitimization or validation of these ideas, these notions of very strictly checking whether the next step follows is very important for largely for these things. So in a lot of sense, one would say like doing theory and to some extent doing experiments is playing around. You have no idea. You just play around with parameters. You put something new here. You put something else inside the machine and see what happens. You're just calculating aimlessly. Maybe something will come. Maybe something will not come. There are probably what you get out of a scientist in terms of one research publication might have needed hundreds of sheets of paper which you're being drawing, writing something, throwing it out, whatever. So there is a very great sense of play, and that's extremely important to hold on to when we understand this practice of science, this practice of research in science all the time. And it comes through, what I really like to see, this whole creative process, tinkering, doodling. You just sit and doodle in your labs, in your papers, etc., etc. So one of the most important, and I'll just stop with that. I said we can keep going on, but I just wanted to highlight this kind of not always purposive. It's not that you begin and say, I know what the answer is going to be for this and I'm going to do it. Right? It's a exploratory, playing, tinkering, doodling, failing, and then getting up and doing other things. But one thing is very interesting to many of them, to a very large number of scientists. Forget about this very extreme high level of science. That, as you saw, is so less. Okay, you really need a huge group of ants to do this work, to support this thing called science as a social activity. And that is rule following. And many times it is just rule following. Many times, if when you're doing, not really, as I said, very pioneering research things, but many times when you're doing calculations, for example, solving some equation, trying to do some basic experiment, running a particular experiment, designing an experiment, running an experiment, much of it is about rule following. And the rule following is dictated by the discourse, let's say, the theoretical sciences or the experimental methods. So this is something which is to give you a very broad bird's eye view of a far more complex thing. But it's what I'm trying to say is this is just like our day-to-day life everywhere. If you ask what is the everyday practice of being a banker or being a social scientist, or if not even in academics and other domains also, you would have things like this. We do a large number of things. And therefore, the question of this special association of method and logic with science becomes a larger, more difficult question. And that's something which we should confront, because scientists are rational, okay? They are rational beings. What I am not convinced is that they attain greater rationality because they are doing this kind of science and publishing these papers and so on. I think in general as a science community, they may be they may be more quote unquote intelligent, okay, and I'm very allergic to that term, but I'm just putting it in a larger public discourse. So there are many scientists who are extremely well read in many things. They are very sharp minds and so on. But other than that, the point about large practice of science in its day-to-day practice does not seem to reflect this kind of concern. So when they want to use this practice, just because they're practicing scientists, they suddenly feel that they have a right to understand society or education or sports or anything else, then I think social scientists and the ordinary citizen has a right to ask them about why they would think that particular attitude should be accepted by everybody. And there is also another very important connection to this. And this is something which I always feel about science. And that's many times we reduce science to just research papers, to just these kinds of work on science. They are the dominant community in the sense they are the most powerful community. Much of the money which goes into science is going to these. But we should remember that a very important part of science, just like the important part of academic in all the disciplines, is research, teaching, and policy. In particular, I think, okay, and I'm saying this, I should be very careful because I'm surrounded by science educationists who may have very different views on this, and I'm welcome a learning debate with you on this. But let me say what I want to say here, that the idea of scientific method and logic is most powerfully transmitted in teaching, present in teaching. So I would go to the extent of saying that school teachers do more to inculcate the image of science than scientists, because scientists are actually too busy to try and talk to people. I mean, including if you look at all this question on March for Science and ask who are the people who are marching for science and so on, you would find that there are actually a large number of people who think science is the answer. Many of them from different political affiliations, many theater activists, many people who think they're not science things at all, but they have an ideal image of science where they think, oh, this is the way, scientists are going to save the society. So there are these things, but it's very, very, what I find always very fascinating is that the kind of people who do most to propagate the ideology of science, which is used by other more powerful communities within science, are the science teachers, both primarily at the school level and of course some at the college level, because that continues. It's the science teachers or the foot soldiers of scientists. And there's a massive hierarchy of labor here. If I'm sure which many of you know, if you look at the way scientific institutes in India, this very unfortunate historical division in India between universities and science institutes, where scientists will do all the research in the science institutes and other people will do the job of teaching in universities and schools and so on, which of course is changing slightly now, has led to a terrible hierarchy of labor, in terms of the kinds of money, simple things like payment, salaries, comfort, travel grants, access to various other infrastructure is enormous for scientists compared to the true workers of science, the true workers who bring the idea of scientific method, ideas of, what does it mean to be science, etc. Maybe sometimes in a not sufficiently thought out way, but it's very much part of it. These science teachers are the ones who are doing such an important role in this, and I don't think they have been recognized by the science community. Forget about the other community. You know, there's still a large number of dismissal of the value of these people, and that the very well-known scientists in our science institutes don't have time to go teach in our colleges and schools, other than some outage, you go do something and you feel good about it. No, it doesn't work. So this is something I think has huge implications for science education, and I think it has to be factored in different ways. So I'm going to now raise the following, to continue this point in the context of social science. So the science education is a good entry into the point of social science. And the questions we want to ask of the education people, I can start with the question of social science and ask, you know, much of what we talk about scientific method is also very deeply related to the question of knowledge. So we want to understand, by looking at this whole parallel of the discussion between science, method, logic, and knowledge, etc., how does the relationship between logic and social science arise? In what sense? Is it only through scientific methodology? Is it by mimicking certain aspects of scientific methodology? Or are there other ways by which you will formulate some of these questions? When I'm asking this question, as many of you are social science students know, it's not the first time or that there are no answers. As I said, I want to think through you with the issues rather than discussing some answer or the other. Because I think that is the real challenge. Because if we understand the foundational issues in this, it hopefully will allow you to come up with your own new ways of looking at many of these things. So this is also related to the question of method in social science, which I won't even go into. The only point I want to make here very quickly is that, and it's always, I'm using this occasion to air my grievance again, which is that, I find it very surprising that social science institutes still do not think that foundational training in philosophy, not just as a discipline, and I think philosophers have to be blamed for the state of philosophy in India, but just as philosophical methods, thinking, critical thinking, and various aspects related to larger issues of philosophy, and the fact that we don't teach either that as foundation course, and we don't teach history and philosophy of science as a core course to social science students. The point is not to promote some discipline I'm vaguely related to. I'm not in academics now, and it doesn't matter to me, frankly. But I think it affects the kind of quality of social science students, the kind of training and learning of their own discipline, which they will get when they are exposed to disciplines like this. So I want to come to this real crucial question about social science now, and I want to frame it slightly differently. I'm not going to start by saying what of science is imitated in social science and does that work, and I don't even want to tell you that just because it works in science it doesn't work in society. I mean, all of us know these things. I want to think of a logic of that. Why would we want to think or even ask whether the very successful practices in science in creating knowledge, why can we not just accept it in social science, and why don't we listen to the scientists and say, look, what we do, you do for society, that is fine. Living up to the grand ideal of Auguste Comte. So the way I want to begin this discussion is by looking at the relationship between method and knowledge. And as we saw, method is what? A way of doing. So let's look at method as a way of doing, okay? And as we saw earlier, that any discipline begins with objects of inquiry. It wants to know what it is going to talk about. So if science is saying it's going to talk about natural phenomena like the blue sky or the green leaves and so on, those become the objects of inquiry. But along with the objects of inquiry, we saw that there is also a way of inquiry. So this is what we did in the earlier session. And to that, I'm going to add a third term here, which is the nature of knowledge in that field. So obviously, the task of science, as the word itself suggests, is about knowledge and ways of knowing, finding something about the world, knowing something about whatever it is that I want to talk about. I can know something about the physical world, the mental world, the spiritual world, whatever. But they're all objects of inquiry of which I want to know something. But is there one meaning of knowledge? Is it that I can say, if I have done this, then I know what it is. In other words, when do I accept that what I know is knowledge? Remember the old philosophical debate about this, which is one of the first things we learn when you study the discipline of epistemology, theory of knowledge, is that, all beliefs are not knowledge. And unless beliefs are true and justified, as in one famous model, then they do not become knowledge. So you have to, some notion of justification is always present. Okay, we will grant that. Okay, I'm not entering there. But I'm saying, are there different kinds of justification in different disciplines? In which case, is it that there is something called scientific knowledge, something called social science knowledge, something called religious knowledge, something called artist knowledge in art? So I want to think through that. So let's see what are the kinds of questions that arise in that. Now, the first point we saw is that scientific knowledge and the relationship to scientific method, as we have seen, it depends on a particular view of knowledge. Remember that, to put it in one sentence, to distill many of the essences, one of the most important aspects of scientific method is to find a logical move from the empirical data that you have in the world to creating knowledge about that empirical data. So we are surrounded by empirical data. We are surrounded by experiences and senses, what we get through our senses. From that, we want to infer something, we want to deduce something, or we want to inductively come to some kind of knowledge about that thing. And the demand that science makes is that the knowledge I create, it has some notion of certainty. And as I said, that was the old debate in scientific method. The certainty is in some sense guaranteed by the use of mathematics, because mathematics is a shorthand for deductive logic. It functions as a shorthand for that. So when I do some things to language, when I use mathematics, I'm guaranteeing you that whatever I call as knowledge is comparatively certain, and it's indubitable. It is also deductive in character, and because that is of much higher value than inductive, because inductive could always be wrong, you're able to construct a structure of knowledge in science which is of this kind. But there are other very important elements of this knowledge, because scientific knowledge related to these principles is also something which is seen as universal, which is applicable across different locales, different local situations. There is some notion of universality as very well captured by the idea of universal laws of nature. They are not just for something which is true in Bangalore or Hyderabad or somewhere. It is not even just true just on Earth. It's a very important jump in our imagination, which is where modern science breaks away from the Greek ideas, which is to believe that the way in which nature functions is not special to the Earth, and that the heavens have to obey the same laws as things on Earth. Very, very important imaginative jump. But that idea that therefore the knowledge which you produce has to say largely, okay, I mean, this is typically of how we would understand scientific knowledge, is universal, asocial. I don't mean asocial in terms of bad behavior, not knowing how to behave in society. Asocial is not dependent on social interests. It's not dependent on whether Indians have discovered something and therefore it's Indian something and this is American something or African something, okay? In that sense of the word asocial, and we will have to look at it carefully and see whether that's right or wrong. It's atemporal in that scientific truths are not, they may be fallible, but in principle through their association with mathematics are largely atemporal. That is the aim. You want to reach, when you want scientific knowledge to be like mathematical knowledge, you're not just saying they should all be written in mathematics so that 2 + 2 = 4. No, you're saying something far more. Mathematical knowledge is atemporal. That is, it does not depend. It's not that you would say 2 + 2 = 4 in 1450, but not true in 1833, and then it again became true in 1956, and now it's not be true after 2020. There is no temporal marker for this knowledge. We should remember again that ideas of universal aspatiality, or what I call as asocial here, atemporality, are also markers of logic. Okay, that ideas that you move away from just local information, local dependence, into something which is far more global and universal. That knowledge must also be repeatable. You can't just have one time moment, one event as standing for scientific knowledge. That event may be true, that the event may have happened, but that does not become scientific. History is a classic instance. The debate on method in history is a very good instance of this. If there have been events which have happened, and that may be true in that they really happened, but if there are no notions of repeatability, no notions of measurability, in the sense that you have data, physical data which refers to it, then you don't know whether it is. You can't say you get into nitpicking on whether it really happened or not happened. All you can say is it cannot be counted as scientific knowledge. So, for example, if I say that I said something 5 minutes back, let's say I said a particular sentence, okay, and you might listen to it and say, no, you didn't say that sentence. Now, the point is, as long as it has been measured, for example, if it is recorded and I can go back and check whether I said it, then it becomes amenable to be used as a knowledge about what I really said or not. But even though I may have said it, but if it is not repeatable and measurable and it is gone, then there is no way we can go back and check and, so it does not become a set of knowledge. It still becomes disputed between us. And this is a very big problem about extending these ideas of scientific knowledge to the other domains. And it's also controllable. Extremely important part of what nature of scientific knowledge should be. So in other words, what we are saying is that it is not just to say that science creates knowledge. It creates knowledge with certain qualities. It only accepts statements with certain qualities as having the status of knowledge. In other words, science defines what it wants to accept as knowledge, and that's extremely important, because when we are fighting with science and other disciplines, etc., very often when people say, oh, that is not knowledge, what we have to look at is, has your discipline defined the contours, the qualities which you want in your discipline to stand for knowledge in that discipline? So we could ask therefore the question, are all kinds of knowledge of the same kind? And one way to answer that, which is what I'm going to focus a little bit now, is to look at the purpose of knowledge. And why? Because for science, there is a good reason why it wants knowledge with all these qualities. There are very good reasons. It's not just doing it because somebody said it, Galileo said it, Newton said it. No. The qualities of knowledge, these qualities of knowledge allow science to do something with it. And the purpose of knowledge is extremely important, because that really defines to us how to approach this question of social sciences, so knowledge within societies, how to re-look at this question of what constitutes knowledge within societies. So very briefly then, if I want to list the purpose of knowledge in science, this is something which you know well, so I'm not going to go much into it. I'm just going to put it here. So let's do it a little bit faster, because much of it is something you know well. Scientific knowledge is not just used to understand the universe. It is not that scientists are all very happy once I sit back and tell you, oh, I've discovered the law of gravity. I know force is proportional to m1, m2 by r squared, so I'm very happy about it, and my job is done. Scientific knowledge does not function at that level, because there is an enormous move, and this is a question which social scientists should ask. Where is this desire coming from? Where is this pressure on scientists coming from? What is it? Just individual human desire, or is it something cultivated by a society, which is knowledge is not just used to understand. It's a very important part of science. I think great science even today is just about the quote unquote purity of understanding. Just understanding a particular phenomena in the world which happens right in front of you. It's great joy also in that. But it is also more. Scientific knowledge is not just about saying, okay, I understood it. It is also about reproducing. It's a constant reproduction of phenomena. It's a constant reproduction of objects. It's such a plethora and excess of reproduction which characterizes science as an institutional activity, producing. That is why you keep producing millions of papers of new work every year. Because scientific knowledge is also used to control phenomena. If we want to understand technology in a very basic sense of the term, right from its origins, whether you want to call it modern technology or pre-modern technology, I really sometimes don't get the purpose of those kinds of distinctions. But there are kinds of social characterizations of these phenomena, including large scale, for example, including the nature of labor in them, etc. But the scientific technology are very important to control phenomena, because if you remember right from the beginning that one of the ways by which scientific knowledge has been used is always in trying to replicate what it is able to understand, what it is able to analyze. In fact, replicating nature in that sense becomes extremely important, because it is through replication of nature part of your understanding also happens. So the knowledge of a particular phenomena is deeply related to the way you intervene in that phenomena. So it is impossible for you to know many things how nature works without intervening. We're engaging with it in very many different ways. So knowledge and the very act of knowing has this explicit engagement of the human subject in it, in the way in which we intervene, and that raises very important questions about the nature of scientific knowledge in this, which is that all our understanding of nature, still using a very old, big classical picture of science as studying nature, that's itself is largely true, and it is so large that it covers so many domains of science. It is worth just holding on to it for our discussion here. That in talking about nature, in discussing how to understand nature, manipulate it, control it, we do, and this is probably explains some part of the reason why it is so socially powerful. It is true that you make nature conform to human interests. And this is very, I think you can see very clearly and very deeply in the biological and the life sciences and what's happening in technological intervention in the life sciences today. But it has always been a part of what constitutes science. But rather than talking about much of that which you might know, and I'm not interested in the critique of that, I want to understand this, this complex way of by which science produces its knowledge. What is of relevance to as a social scientist is to ask the question, what are the conditions that allows you to create this type of knowledge? So just because a scientist says, okay, I want to create scientific knowledge, which I want it to have the following qualities, does not mean they can just go in and start doing something and start creating it. There are conditions which is necessary for creating this type of knowledge. So let me list some of them. Okay. Again, some parts of it which you may know, you may have heard about it from a different context. I'm putting it in this logic of my argument I'm setting out before you, okay, in order for us to think through this object, think through this particular question. The first point is, scientific knowledge is possible only under certain conditions. You can't just give me some glass in front of me and say, oh, do science with it. And if you do it, I'll ask you, okay, what do I do when I'm supposed to do science with it? There are very important philosophical, if you don't want to call it philosophical, you call it conceptual, social, or whatever, let's call it conceptual foundations, which are the conditions for it. The scientific, if you are talking about scientific knowledge, some of the most important conditions for these are that the object-subject distinction is extremely important. In other words, I am able to distinguish myself as a human subject, could be a scientist, who is different from the object which is being studied. So when I'm studying a mug in front of me is different from studying the hand which is part of me. Because what I do with that object depends on this understanding of the distance between object and subject. Okay, this is what you also, I'm sure all of you, we use the term, everybody I know, even school children today use objective, subjective, and there's such a lovely long history in science studies, in history of science, of what the meaning of objective, subjective are. This very good work by Peter Gallison and Daston is something which you could look at. So this is a long history, and it is a bread and butter subject for philosophy. The whole question of object, subject, whether their relationship between them, etc. But for science, it's very important to be able to create this condition for recognizing that this is an object that is independent and outside of me, which is in a one-line definition of reality in the basic philosophy course you begin with is to say something is real when it is outside me, which is not part of my own imagination of my body, and independent of me. So whether I like it or not, the mug is there. That is a very important first step of realism, the zeroth order of realism that's necessary for science. But there are more things. Once you create the subject-object divide, that condition, the object cannot react to my questions of query, the method I use to question it, to find out knowledge about it, right? So I'm doing it in a more indulgent manner, right? By saying objects are not willful. They don't have. If I want to, measure the weight of this mug which I have in front of me, the object is not going to say, no, why are you doing that? You're shaming me. I don't want to know my weight. Why are you trying to find my weight? Objects are not willful. They do not try and deceive you. They do not react to the kind of questions I may have to the thing. If I ask this mug, what force should I throw you on the ground so that you will crack? The object is not going to say, hey, don't do that to me. I don't like to be cracked. And we might take this for granted about the world, but it is not so simple. I want to look at other knowledge systems where you will see that this is not such a simple question. You need to create these conditions to even create the kind of knowledge that you want. It is based also on the conditional belief. And this is one of the famous Humean argument. The belief that nature is uniform, and the Baconian argument that nature is mute and it will not yield its answers easily. And the task of science is to get answers from nature about what nature is. It's not going to speak to you. You have to coerce it. You have to torture it in a different meaning of torture. You have to pull it out of somebody who doesn't want to yield the secret, but it is a very different kind. It's not that it is resisting, it is just mute, and you have to discover what it is trying to tell you. And without kind of condition, you cannot create what you call a scientific knowledge, or not. You have to think about that. So objects are also indifferent to what I say about them or what I know about them. Like the mug, they do not resist when you do experiments on them. You can do any kind of experiments. You can see under what force it will break, under what temperature will it burn. Okay, that's part of what it is to be an object. Suppose I grant all that and say, well, that is what is called inanimate objects, and science is a study of inanimate objects. Then you should ask the question, then is scientific knowledge only relevant for such objects, inanimate, mute, and unfeeling objects? Can I use that paradigm, that model of scientific knowledge for other kinds of knowledge systems, to know knowledge about other things which are not mute, which are not inanimate, which are not unfeeling? But we know that you have scientific study. Psychology is a classic instance of study of human mental states. So what does it do there? Does psychology, find a balance between these kinds of things? Or the scientific study of humans, I mean, this is just a way I'm posing this question for you to think about it rather than suggest that these are what it is. That's why I'm posing many of these as questions, so we have a dialogue around these questions. Or is it the scientific study of humans creates inanimate objects out of the humans it studies? And it's true for society when science studies society at all. So for example, biology is a classic instance of a scientific study of a human object, which is the body, with various kinds of restrictions on what you can do to that object, but still focusing on very different kind of chemical structures of the body, rather than far more problematical structures which have to do with things like consciousness or many other aspects of biology, which are sometimes dealt with in psychology, but not directly in proper quote unquote proper biology. So these are the one set of conditions by which what we call a scientific knowledge can be generated. These are the necessary conditions, and there are more. You cannot have scientific knowledge if you do not remove the question of ethics away from the very idea of scientific method. Again, this is not a claim I'm making. There's some really interesting work on this from history of science, for example, on how the very idea of ethics, in all human systems, in all societies, knowledge was always seen with a lot of suspicion. Every society was suspicious about knowledge because it was not sure whether, knowing itself can be unregulated. Can I really know anything I want? Can I be curious about whatever it is that I want to be curious about? And this the common trope in many of these serial killer movies, which Hollywood has made a fetish of, is to show them as children experimenting with insects, pulling off their wings and seeing how they do, or trying to burn a cat's tail and so on. And if you ask the person who was doing it, they might say that it's a part of knowledge gathering, trying to find out how do these insects and cats function under these kind of interventions in them. But would that constitute a meaningful scientific method? So in the history of science, and there is a long, I'm going to send you a list of readings tomorrow, so which can be distributed, a collection of it, some of which I've already said earlier. And there's another piece of mine in Current Science on the ethics of curiosity, where I discuss this historical way, where disjunction of how the question of ethics gets removed from the question of knowledge. And unless the idea of ethics is removed as a constraint from scientific knowledge, what you call as science, then it inhibits the growth of science. And the power of scientific method is its capacity to grow at this rate. Much of it is being fueled by the fact that there were very deep problematical questions of ethics which were not part of it. And today, as a response, we know it's impossible for you to do anything in medical science or even in the disciplines like anthropology without having ethics clearance. And that's a part of the way in which it is coming back into the idea of scientific method once it is started expanding its domain of interest into humans and so on. Okay, so but in the classical picture of understanding scientific definition of knowledge, ethical values are a big problem. But this is not the way in which all knowledge systems have been. There are many knowledge systems which will not accept the fact that ethics can be dissociated from the very idea of knowledge. And one of the great instances comes from Buddhist, Buddhist philosophers. And in particular, I was, there is this very interesting work on the work. One of the greatest books I think in philosophy is Nagarjuna's Mula Madhyamika Karika, which is actually a book of logic, and it's of such a nitpicking logic that like many philosophers have done after them, you have to write these huge commentaries just to make sense of that short volume of what Nagarjuna writes. But what is very interesting in one of the commentaries of a Buddhist monk who is writing this commentary on Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti's work, they begin with this very important point. They said, yes, we can do all this logical analysis and nitpick and fight with each other, but without the idea of compassion, this is not valid knowledge. This is not what we want to accept as meaningful knowledge. If we lose the very idea of compassion in this kind of linguistic, philosophical, scientific gymnastics. I'm not saying that this should immediately become part of scientific knowledge. No, I'm just pointing out how different knowledge systems have offered us different models of what knowledge is, the very idea of knowledge, and what are the necessary conditions for those kinds of knowledge to be present. So when I look at questions of, for example, Buddhist logic and tribal logic, which I'll speak very briefly about, you can ask the question, can we blindly use science's definition of knowledge for understanding social processes, or should we be clear in what contexts they can be used and where they cannot be? And again, this is not about whether we support science or not science. We are only asking, what is the tool useful for? To use another old example which many philosophers tend to use, influenced by people like Heidegger and others, is to say, well, if I have a hammer, am I going to use a hammer to fix a bulb in my room? It's a very different tool. A tool doesn't fit that particular context. So what we are asking is, scientific knowledge is a set of tools which includes all these conditions to discover something, and it is true, it is knowledge, we accept it, but is that very obviously transferable to a very vast domain of human activity, knowledge in various human activities? And it is far more complex than just saying one thing about ethics and so on. It is also fundamentally a worldview, the way we look at the world. And one of the interesting lessons from the pre-scientific, which I'm calling it pre-scientific, which I think is worth thinking about, is to see that the aim is not to make the inanimate within the humans, but to see all inanimate like human. And you see this in so many cultures where nature, human distinction is on a continuum. It is not of a kind. And that's an extremely important implication for how you would study an object. So if you want to ask a question, what could Jaina science be? It does not mean that Jaina science will not be about inquiry, asking these kinds of questions, etc., etc. But you're also asking the question, what are the conditions for the type of knowledge? What would they think as valid knowledge? Would they think doing dissection or cutting down a tree would constitute valid means which lead to valid knowledge? Or you do know a lot of things in cutting down a tree, but would you say that that is not the way I'm going to have to do to get knowledge, because I do not consider what I learned after cutting down the tree to be a value-filled commodity called knowledge? And that is exemplified across domains and disciplines. I'll give you two quick examples perhaps before we have time. I'm just going to do it a little bit fast because I'm sure you've thought about much of this. So just to give you an indication that there's always been a major debate, and I'm sure I've been reading something on tribal education, the kinds of challenges in it and so on. And I know a student who is one of my own students worked with one of the tribal groups when he wrote his thesis on looking at tribal models related to knowledge and learning. And another one whom I know, whose work I know a little bit about, is working on a tribal education system. So I think it's a very interesting, many education students will know much more about it than I do. But you already know there that the people have been talking about a variety of issues related to it, which is that there is a notion of knowledge which is very much present within them, which is the knowledge. It could be about knowledge about many things. I'm just using a standard typology. Knowledge about nature and forest, there's knowledge about themselves, knowledge about healing, health, death, and so many things. And those constitute knowledge for that community. But that knowledge does not seem to share many of the characteristics of our scientific knowledge. One, because of the fundamental conditions which you need for scientific knowledge are not met, in that the distinction between the human, tribal, and the objects of nature, for example, the trees or whatever, rivers, etc., are not as distinctly made as it is done in this subject-object dichotomy, which also means that the kind of interventions which is allowed for the particular human to get knowledge from nature is also very different. And the notions of coercing something out of knowledge, nature in order to know about it becomes something very different in this case. And it is also, as I said, the very important point. The purpose of knowledge influences what kind of knowledge you want. It influences what you mean by knowledge. If the purpose of knowledge is not to have better control over your system, not to exploit the system for its resources, then isn't that a very different type of knowledge that you produce? Along with it, the fact that the knowledge, in that one way to understand it is to say the knowledge, what you would call as knowledge within these communities, has ethical dimensions. And very importantly, they are not knowledge just about the object. So one of the consequences of object-subject divide is to say that what I say about the object is only the knowledge about that object. So when I'm saying something about the mug, and I'm saying it's got so much weight, it's got, this kind of, when I hit it, it makes this kind of sound, whatever else it is, those kinds of properties. We tend to talk about knowledge as if these are just qualities of this object, the mug. But I think, well, the examples from many of these other traditions, including social science knowledge, what they ask us is, can you really dissociate the knowledge of the mug from my own capacities, from the human aspect of it? So for example, even when I say something like, oh, this mug has so much weight, and it looks as if that is a quality of the mug, not really true, because that is a quality of something called gravity. There is something called quality of the feeling of gravity in my hand, my experience of my hand to the idea of gravity. So it is not just to say, well, that's just the fact that, the mug has got that weight, and that's actually about the object. It has nothing to do with us. I think this idea that knowledge systems which mix the knowledge of the subject and the object, the humans and society with the object which is being studied, has a very different character. And as many people who work with this tribal knowledge systems have pointed out, the whole knowledge system is based on a very different ontology, which is the beings that are part of our world. The beings, the way in which the tribals would construct what they call as nature, in which they are a part of, not something standing outside looking at it, intervening it, controlling it, exploiting it, leads to a very different ontology, different set of beings that inhabit that world. And therefore, the very idea of what constitutes tribal knowledge is very different from what would constitute scientific knowledge. And they both have their own values. The tribal knowledge is used by them. There are very important purposes. Medical thing, you know very well what kind of medical practices they may have, which is based on these ontologies and the ethical engagement with nature and so on. So there is a purpose of that knowledge, but the definition of what is knowledge, what is valid as a cultural good, and one of the ways you think, how do you know what constitutes knowledge, is what culture keeps transmitting, which is now taken up by the function of education in your schools, and you decide this is what is worth transmitting to the next generation. So definitely within communities of tribals, you have that process, and they have their own different kind of knowledge, which has a very different purpose. It's very different from science, not because the tribals are not scientific, not because they don't have the logical capacity, because this itself is filled, as I said, with deductive and inductive understanding of the world around them. But the foundations, what they accept as basic conditions for knowing are different. And therefore, the kind of knowledge they produce are different. Now, when a scientific community looks at it and says, that is not knowledge, that is not science, these people don't know what they're doing, Okay, a discourse which is very much present, not just within dominant science communities which have looked at various social issues in the country, but also in education. We know this very well. You know this far better than I do. So we will have to ask the question, how do we then come up with an imagination of meaningful, purposive knowledge in our social sciences? As a final example for today, before since I think we'll have time just to finish, I think it's important to engage with this question. We could very quickly look at a contrast to the question of religion. Again, we talk about science-religion conflict. I'll come back to that later on in the historical sense. But we could ask the same kind of questions just to get a handle on how to think through this problem. We could ask, what is the kind of knowledge in religion? Do they have something called knowledge? Would you want to say that there is knowledge about God, divinity? Is a lot of knowledge about religion actually knowledge about humans? And that's something you can see in all religious traditions. It's also about being very important knowledge about what it is to be human. While there is a very different kind of ontology which is present. Is the knowledge about God, let us say, as an object very different? Is there a subject-object divide between divinity and the human subject? And all religions struggle and very often express the oneness between the subject-object in a very profound sense of the term. So how do we understand it? How can you get scientific knowledge of a system which is not based on the fundamental presuppositions which can lead to scientific knowledge? Like in the case of the tribal oneness between the human subject and nature, oneness between the human and the divine, for example. What kind of conditions are present in this, which will allow us to produce knowledge like science? So should we even ask the question, is religious knowledge scientific? What is the purpose of this knowledge? So we could have many, it's not that religious knowledge has no purposes. Look at all religions have great commentaries. In fact, as you know, all philosophical traditions in every religious tradition comes from this question of, all theological traditions are basically philosophy in the context of certain questions of knowledge. Very deeply analytical, very deeply argumentative, very deeply logical. That is what characterizes all theological traditions in, it could be Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Sikhism, etc. Buddhism, of course, Jainism, and so on. So there is a articulation of the purpose of the knowledge. It could be liberation, whether one accepts that or not, but it is this articulation which is present. There's a knowledge about liberation, about becoming one. It's about the self. It's even about just having what are called experiences, religious experiences. It's about knowledge about how to live our lives. We will have to then ask if the religious community in these different religions accept these bits of things as knowledge, then what is that knowledge used for? Is it used for replication? Is it used for control? Is it used for intervening in the domain which you know something about? Because I know something, let us say as a theologian who has studied this deeply, experienced whatever within that community, just with all that knowledge of having understood it, experienced it, is it for me to control the world of the divine? Is it for me to intervene in it and do things which I don't like about it and change some things in it? Is it even a goal and the aim of it? And what it is only pointing out, what this is pointing out is that these are autonomous knowledge systems. The reason they are different from scientific methodology is not because they do not have notions of logical thinking or a method within them. It is just that what we would call as a metaphysical foundation, the presupposition, the conditions for generating that kind of knowledge are different in each one of these domains. And therefore, that the methodological questions remain, but you may come up with completely different kinds of knowledge claims and different purposes of knowledge. The tribal does not want to use the knowledge of nature in order to control it and exploit it, but just to live with it. The knowledge in religion may be used to be in a context to have richer experiences or to open up new truths about ourselves, not to go and control the world of the divine or to intervene it or replicate it or to justify it through these means. Does this mean that either they are illegitimate works of illegitimate as knowledge, or what are the ways by which we want to justify them as knowledge? And remember one thing, for those who say knowledge is justified belief, it is not that knowledge among the tribals or in religious communities or in art or in social sciences, which we will talk about, are all done because people think they like to call that as knowledge. All you have to do is to read these philosophical texts related to theology to know how profoundly logical, argumentative these notions of what we think is good processes of dialogue, debate, critique, which are present in them. So what then is special in these knowledge systems, so that when they are told that they are not scientific, they are not logical, etc., how do you even respond to them? Because it is not that all the time. I mean, there is a lot of fraudulent stuff in everything. So let us not get into saying, oh, that religious group did this, etc. That is all granted and given. Those are social processes. I am talking about the basic philosophical understanding of different domains of knowledge. Okay, how these knowledge systems come about, how they get validated, what are the conditions for their appearance, and how the community accepts something as knowledge and something as belief. There are many things. Each of these communities reject something as belief and something as knowledge, but they are based on more fundamental, what I would call as metaphysical foundations. As I said, you can continue to do this on art. I think maybe I'll just stop in a couple of minutes, maybe with art, because I'll begin with social science and anthropology. There's very limited is left. So maybe I can try and, okay, let's see how much I can do. Just give me a few minutes and I'll see. So you could ask the question, what is the kind of knowledge in art? Is there knowledge in literature? Does literature produce knowledge? We know now there's been a lot of interesting discussion within the literature community, which is talking about knowledge in literature. And we could ask, what is the purpose of this knowledge then? If there is knowledge in art, that something is artistic, something is aesthetic, something is beautiful, something does something, etc., what is the purpose of that knowledge? Do they not create knowledge about it? Everything, whether it's music, dance, visual arts, writing, literature, novels, they all construct their objects of knowledge. They have conditions which, if you sit down, or a person who is working in that discipline can, if they give us a talk tomorrow about it, they will be able to tell you what are the conditions, what are the metaphysical assumptions in music, dance, visual arts, literature, architecture, etc., which leads to this idea of knowledge within them. In many of them, what is very interesting is, like the tribal case, like the religious case, in many of these art disciplines, what we call as, these types of art, the subject-object divide is always a problem. There is always a problem about the purpose of knowledge there. Is the purpose of the knowledge domain present in art to control that domain? And where they do it, there are people who do it, who use the knowledge to control the domain of art. We know this, for example, in certain forms of classical dance, very famously discussed in the context of Bharatanatyam, when it takes over the Sadir, the Devadasi tradition, and makes it more exclusive, so it doesn't let in the original community to be part of it. Those social processes are very much present. And again, you can see that when it happens, there is a purposive use of knowledge, saying that this knowledge which we possess as Bharatanatyam artists today comes from a long classical traditions linked to Natya Shastra and various other things, and therefore people who do not have it cannot be part of this particular dance. So knowledge is definitely used for that. So you can see that there are complexities, just like some parts of religious knowledge will be used for that. But what is this? How do you even think about What are the conditions which will create something which we call as knowledge within art? So what do we do with that knowledge in art? Is it just to create more art? Is it to say something about the world? Is it to build rockets? Is it to build new experiences in us? Does it teach us knowledge about what it is to be human? And in all these cases, I know I'm going a bit fast, but because I want to make this point so we have an idea as a base by which to answer these questions. What I'm trying to say is, in all these kinds of knowledge systems, which they are producing knowledge, if you look at the metaphysical foundations, they are different from that of science. And therefore, the knowledge they produce is different. I can't get into this point, but we can talk about it later perhaps. The debate in Ayurvedic, whether Ayurveda is knowledge, medical knowledge versus modern medical science, should be discussed at this level, looking at it as domains of knowledge, elements of knowledge, conditions of knowledge, the presuppositions which create what we call as medical knowledge versus Ayurvedic knowledge and so on. I will just end here since I think we have almost come to the end. I'm sorry, Ritesh, I'm just trying to end at 7 so we can take questions later on so I can always reply to them tomorrow, because I just want to finish this part and then we are done. And again, because somebody had also asked this question, why is it that in all philosophical discussions we keep saying that philosopher said this, rather than really talking about what was said? And I totally agree with it. One of my greatest dissatisfactions with the way we do philosophy is how we have reduced philosophy to philosophers rather than a philosophy. And this kind of, you could ask the question, what is the kind of knowledge in philosophy? Part of the problem is there are many different disciplines in philosophy, like analytical, continental, Indian, etc. And each one of them might construct very different kinds of knowledge claims. And there's always a contention, and I don't understand why philosophers keep doing this. Among most of the communities, among all the communities, the one I have seen most asking this repeatedly this question among philosophy community is, oh, he's not a philosopher, she's not a philosopher, etc. They're all interested in saying who is a philosopher and who is not, rather than really looking at whether what is it that they are saying, what is philosophical in what they are writing, thinking, talking, and so on. But within this, you can see a very important track of this. Many of you may not be from these disciplines. I'm not going to bore you with this. But to answer the question which was also asked is that a lot of knowledge in philosophy has been reduced to knowledge about what authors have said. So the reason why people keep saying this author said this, that author said that, is because you have reduced philosophical knowledge into what Aristotle said, what he meant by that particular word, or what Kant said, or what somebody said. And therefore, you are now looking at what exactly that word could have meant in the context of the book. That's a very important function, by the way. That's important knowledge. But it is one kind of philosophical knowledge. It's one particular, which therefore influences disciplines of the use of philology, the use of looking at how language has been used, meaning in the particular word used by the author, and so on. But for me, I really think that philosophy creates knowledge about the world. It creates knowledge about the humans who reflect on knowledge about the world. It gives you profoundly insightful knowledge about disciplines. And I think philosophy of science teaches you, at least has taught me, I don't know about others, more about the way science works than just doing science. So definitely there is a kind of a knowledge creation that we do. And then you ask the question, why do we need this knowledge? What really is the purpose of this knowledge? That becomes a far more greater problem, because obviously the Indian society doesn't think we need this kind of philosophical knowledge, since they seem to be closing down most of the philosophy departments, or not funding them, or not treating them very well. But that apart, I mean, that small complaint apart, that what I want to end with here is just to point out that to lead to the point of what is knowledge in social science, I think these are the kinds of questions which is very important. And when I'm just going to take a very few minutes of this on Monday or Tuesday when we start for the next session. I want to lead into this question. So please keep this in mind when you come back on Tuesday, which is that we should remember that the nature of scientific knowledge in its association with certainty, deductiveness, universality, atemporality, repeatability, measurability, controllability, etc., those qualities and all the conditions which create those possibilities, how do they transfer in the context of the social sciences. How do we even imagine this kind? Because that defines what could be a method in the social sciences. It defines how the very idea of sciences in the context of society can be understood. We have already seen this problem in the context of using sciences in the context of society, like in the case of tribal knowledge, religious knowledge, artistic knowledge, and so on. But there are very specific questions which arise in the context of the social sciences. And let us try and I'll very briefly only spend time on this so that we have an idea of it, because I want to come to the remaining parts of what we are going to talk about, which is the direct relationship between science, religion, science and education, science and the state, and so on. So I'll stop here. Thank you. Ritesh, we can go ahead with some questions if you like for a few minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Sundar. We'll take a couple of minutes. You can put down your questions in the chat box, and some questions we can take up right now. I would request the participants who would like to raise the question to raise the hand so that we'll be able to follow them and take it up for discussion now. We have one question in the chat box.
Okay. Yeah, I can see that now. Is it the scientists in India? Scientists in India worry about how to improve the quality. Could you comment on the situation of social sciences, including in science studies? I presume you mean improving the quality of social science and humanities? Or is it about, I presume that's what you mean, right? Like how is the internal community reflecting on the quality of the situation in the social science and humanities, I suppose, right? Yeah, like all communities, particularly academic communities, this has always been a major conflict. And part of the conflict is also being fueled by questions to do with political ideologies, to do with questions of, thinking certain kinds of social science and humanities is worth doing, certain kinds of social science and humanities is not worth doing, some which are politically correct, some which are politically wrong, and so on. So there are various other factors which have come into it, which thankfully has been away from the larger science community. I think this question about, how to improve the quality in the context of social science and humanities is another dimension. I mean, there's a lot about it, and I'm sure we have read about many people writing about it. Let me just focus on one dimension so that we can, because it's something very special to social science and humanities, and which is that, a large number of questions, the large number of themes within the social science and humanities has to do with the particularity of Indian society. So unlike sciences where a particle physics person is doing something which some particle physics person somewhere in the US or Australia is doing, in the social science and humanities, in history, anthropology, sociology, etc., we are not doing that. There are very specific localities which are being responded to. You're talking about the Indian situation far more in these disciplines than you do in the science question. And therefore, we need to articulate how to understand the local. What are the kinds of resources by which to understand these local descriptions and how they become globally accepted. So we now have a global model of scientific knowledge, which is driven by science, because one of the most important social aspects of science is not just the knowledge creation, but the institutionalization and the internationalization. No other academic community travels across the world so much, collaborates across the world so much. Nor does the government give us all money to keep going to meetings of international meetings, whereas the government sets aside a huge amount of money, and every institution in India sets aside money to enable scientists to go meet other scientists around the world. So part of it is because you think science is global. The issues you talk about are not about society, social issues around your society, which I think has led to a problem in the quality of Indian science, by the way, but that's a separate argument. So when the real problem with this, okay, so I've just stopped at this point because you can go and I'm just pointing this out in the context of validation within the global community. So when we write about Indian context, how will it get accepted in a global community of sociologists, economists, and anthropologists and others? How does it speak to the way they have constructed their discourse? So there's a great problem. I mean, there are two major problems. One, we do not have enough journals in India in these disciplines, which will allow us to be able to express and articulate our own imagination and impressions of what we want to do, right? And two, we do not, to get legitimized and get published abroad, you will have to make gestures to what has been done within that discourse. So we tend to understand the Indian society as if it is the empirical data will be provided by Indian society, but the theoretical reflection will come from the global society. And this is, I think, one of the most important problems, and this is one which led Gopal Guru and me to write both our books, partly to make sense of it, not to take one position or the other, but to even just understand the implications of this. So this is just one set of questions to point to you about, you know.
Can I ask a question? If you
Sure.
yeah. No, usually in the discussions on philosophy, we bring
Yeah.
out the distinction between teleological purpose and the instrumental purpose.
Okay.
And in the case of science more so, the need for understanding the the process and the method of science is also critical. So would you therefore say, I mean, looking at the discussion, would you therefore say that tribal knowledge has a more teleological orientation as compared to scientific knowledge?
Okay, the teleological has to be, you're very right. The teleological is an important question. One of the major debates which happens in the origin of scientific method with Galileo, Newton, etc., is this response to the teleological. Is the response to say, because if the final cause, or I mean the first cause and the final purpose are the goals of your knowledge system, like for example philosophy, then the great recognition for the empirical scientists in the scientific method was to reject them and say those are not the goals of the purpose of my knowledge in science. Okay, and therefore for a long time there is this tension between the importance of causation and the ideas of first causes and original cause, etc., versus description. So when Galileo is talking about it, he's still talking about the importance of description in a particular manner, etc., because they are inheriting the Greek tradition, which is which promotes his ideas of teleology, first cause, etc. So I would say that this is only very special to a particular historical engagement between Europe and the Greek tradition. The teleological arises in theology. It's a very important question of theology. It arises in Advaita, for example. The first cause principles are always very important, generally in theology. But I think we know that there have been many knowledge systems which are present, which are not necessarily looking at it as final purposes or about very specific causation mechanisms. They may have a story of causation, but not in the case of the first cause, the original cause, the primordial cause, etc. I would think what really differs, for example, in the tribal thing is their cosmology, or in the sense of the words I've been using, the metaphysical foundations of the way they understand the world, the things which inhabit nature for them. That itself implies a different kind of notion of knowledge and different purpose for knowledge, different qualities which are needed for something to be called as knowledge. So I would say that would be far more important. Certain religious traditions, of course, have these questions of the ultimate purpose and the first cause, etc., is important, but they are not. They are about the religious knowledge per se. They're not necessarily about knowledge about the world which arises in religious practices.
Okay, thank you. Do we have some more? I don't see any hand raises.
Okay.
But I do see some questions in the chat box.
Let me see something which immediately connects to what I've said. If there's something really, everything I will do respond tomorrow. I mean next class. Okay, Ritesh, you can help me if you think there's something which can speak to many of the people in the session. I can do it.
Biswajit has a question about control.
Okay.
He says, isn't control of the self, social and natural, a more fundamental phenomenon in that it is more inherent as a purpose for any kind of knowledge system?
Okay, you know, the control of the self, social and natural. Okay. Because there are many meanings of control. So let me, maybe it might be useful to think about it, because there is a biological narrative that humans are fundamentally selfish, okay? Or there are moral narratives which say that humans the basic quality of human is to control others, oppress others, and so on. Okay, I have a problem with naturalizing certain of these qualities of humans as being natural tendencies of humans. The idea of control is very much a social phenomena. There is ideas of, let's look at one of the most important examples of control, which will happen within families. You don't even have to look at, nature, social, etc. Or in relationships within two people, relationship within a family, friends, spouses, whatever it is, those kinds of relations. And there are, many things which we learn about control, which may become part of our practice within families or friends, etc., are also influenced by the larger social discourse on control. Our capacity to have seen, to be a part of a scientific technological world, which has largely been based on a particular notion of control, which is that the earliest technological machines come in order to, in the words of the early technologists, to remove the drudgery of ordinary physical work. It removes this, it liberates human beings away from doing the basic chores. And today your digital technology liberates you from doing what Gary Kasparov in his book Deep Thinking calls as menial mental tasks, which includes remembering, calculating, etc. And I think those are extremely important tasks for us, and we should not be losing those capacities. But anyway, so notions of control have been very deeply influenced by our technological control, which through technologies of control, which has allowed us control over many things, including somebody using a smartphone, a father using a smartphone to control where his children are, what they're doing, etc. So I think control is an interesting question, and I don't want to simplify it by saying this is really not the case here. But I think I would just want to invite you to open up the way you think of control by thinking of control not as something over which you have authority, over which you put your imprint, but think of it more as your way to be with that thing which you are interested in, which you're talking about, which you're producing a knowledge about. So there are different forms of understanding what one could mean by control, I think. But this is an interesting question which has to be opened up in different ways.
Perhaps you could take, I would just pick up the last question
Okay.
Suchita has asked this question. She says, as you said, there is a distinction between object and subject. In saying so, how do you describe medical science, as we cannot mute the object in this type of study?
Yeah, that's, medical science is a classic instance which is at the fulcrum between, maybe the so-called hard sciences and the social sciences. Okay, biology itself plays a very important part there, in that historically, biology was very influential in the development of social sciences as a discipline. In medical science, um, is really a very important part in this thing between the object subject, because it is knowledge about the subject, and the subject is functioning as the object. This is not new to medical science also, on the other hand, because you have another very good example of it, which is the study of nature. And one of the, I think, a classical conundrum about study of nature is that we as a human are studying nature, but we are also part of nature. So in the classical tradition, where you look at humans as outside nature, and then you make a distinction between natural and artificial by saying artificial are things that are created by humans, whereas natural is non-created by humans. Although a nest which is created by a bird is still called natural, although it's created by a bird. That tension you can see throughout in the ideas of the synthetic, the artificial, the building, the creation, and because it keeps out the human away from nature, but it's studying nature of which the human is a part of. And this is what I've elsewhere referred to as internal epistemologies, which is that when I look at an object outside me and I look at it as outside me and I talk about it, I can do various things with it. I'm able to produce some ideas of knowledge. But when I'm looking at inside me, then it's a completely different way of, or let me put it in the way we've been talking about today. The conditions which create scientific knowledge, which is the distance between subject, object, distinction between them, etc., do not hold. So what really then happens to the nature of science within it? The modern medical science, it's very useful to compare this with other medical traditions within tribal medical systems, other medical systems, cultural systems like Unani, Siddha, Ayurveda, for example. And if you look at Ayurveda, for example, there are completely different ways of understanding nature of body and the nature of our own engagement with nature within that system. So the very idea of what you mean by health and what it means to inquire about that health within you is so different. But yet, modern science has a deep and abiding problem with Ayurveda as I don't know, scientific or whatever. They just don't think it's part of modern science. It's extremely, difficult to go to a doctor and talk about Ayurvedic thing without them getting very upset at you, because they say, no, it's all, unscientific. Yes, we have to recognize that the difference between Ayurveda and medical science, modern medical science, is not just about what kind of chemicals you give to treat us, whether it's so-called herbal, even they are chemicals in some sense, versus some synthetic chemicals that you might make. More important, and this is the most important thing, that the very theories of body which Ayurveda has to use in order to prescribe what it does is very different from a theory of the body which modern biology uses in order to prescribe medicines. So in other words, knowledge is not just about the content of what I say in the end, but it is this condition. So I want you to go back and reflect repeatedly on the conditions which are needed for producing the kind of knowledge we produce in each of these domains. And the conditions for producing the kind of knowledge in Ayurveda is based on the fact that the subject-object distinction does not hold, it cannot be broken, and that the very theory of the body is a very complex idea of what the body is. with the notions of subtle body and various other things, which we have to understand in the proper context. You need a different framework to make sense of it and so on. So I would call that as the basic condition which can, before we even agree or disagree on whether this is really correct knowledge or not. And you can raise the same question about society. When we as members of society are going to study society, where the objects of society are not going to sit quietly and mute, listening to whatever you do to them, that has very different implications on what you can do and what kind of knowledge we should be hoping to get. You cannot produce knowledge without this ethical imperative in social sciences. And that's not knowledge. That goes back to questions of control, etc. So hopefully we'll see that on Tuesday very briefly in the first part of our session.
Yeah. I think it's 7:20 now. Should we?
I don't mind if people are willing to sit for a few more minutes.
Oh, then there are some really interesting questions in between, which I
let's do that.
Skipped. Yeah, there's Vivek who has asked, how do these conditions and presuppositions of any system of knowledge come about? Do the knowledge producers in the respective fields decide and work on these conditions?
Okay, good. I think, yeah. So first of all, if you are within a community of practitioners, right? Just like the question of control, the question of knowing seems to be essential to human functioning, not human interest, but just human functioning in a society. So if I do not know how to survive, I cannot survive in this world. So there's a very primitive notion of the idea of knowledge and its relation to purpose. Okay, the whole discussion with the context of science, philosophy, and other disciplines arise when there is a recognition that certain forms of knowledge, for example, knowledge through thinking, as against knowledge through experience alone, have very different characteristics. So knowledge through experience can cheat you, you may get deceived, etc., etc. So there is a history of suspicion towards this kind of knowledge. So I'm just simplifying a much larger complex picture. But communities which are able to function with that knowledge in order to, for the purpose for which they define this thing called knowledge, for example, knowledge of hunting as a purposive definition of knowledge, because I need hunting to survive. I look at what knowledge I need in order to be able to hunt, in order to survive. And that knowledge becomes accepted within a community. So it's a very social commodity. Knowledge is not my individual commodity. It is a social commodity by its very definition, that it is needed for the activity of the community to survive, let's say hunting. And I have something called knowledge, which I can share and transmit, and from which I learn certain things. And it is that practice of that knowledge, and this is true for right from yoga, for body practices, meditation, thousands of years of meditative practices of the mind and the things associated with it, as well as simple things like farming in agriculture or hunting or whatever else. You can go back to these old communities and see that the community then recognizes that there are certain constraints and conditions which arise due to its social character. And that's a crucial point. For example, even in science, the subject-object divide does not arise just as something which they think about and somebody said, oh, let's do this picture of the world, that the subject-object, we are independent, etc. There is a long philosophical discussion and debate which is being responded to in this question. And it is, there are many aspects to this point. I think for our purposes here, I think it's probably useful to recognize that these conditions, the validation of what is knowledge within different types of activities are part of certain forms of social processes. And that's why you cannot really think and say that, well, I don't need society and other people for me to come up with my knowledge. Science is important. Science can be an isolatory activity. I'm sitting and solving something and doing something. But for it to become knowledge, It has to be a social process, a social production of a particular kind. And that's how these conditions arise.
There's another question from Hazina. She says, Prof, how do you see Heideggerian view of science being an obstacle in our way to understand the essence of being? Like the weight and shape of mug overpower every other way of knowing the mug.
Okay. Very quickly, I mean, there is a lot one can do, and maybe for the other viewers, a little bit of more of Heidegger. But okay, let me get back to a potential scientist response to this. Okay, I think, you know, there is something which is important with Heidegger's, also his essay on question concerning technology, and later on about Husserl's connection about the crisis of the European sciences. There is some, I think, interesting reflection on the nature of science and scientific objects. But scientists have been very unsympathetic to these kinds of views, and there is a particular reason for it. And I really do think, in the case of Heidegger, definitely as compared to Husserl, the nature of science in terms of its practice, in my view, I don't think was either known to him or appreciated by him in the way it should have been. So, like it has happened with a lot of philosophers, particularly from the social science tradition, who have made claims against science, for example, many of them have been dismissed by scientists by saying they just don't get it. And that's part of the criticism by Weinberg and Hawking when they said, philosophy of science is just a gloss. What does it know about science, right? I'm not saying Heidegger should have known about science, but there are some extremely important revolutionary paradigms of science which is happening at that time, both with relativity theory, quantum theories, and so on, which allows scientists to come up with very easy counter arguments to the ideas of Heidegger, both in the question concerning technology and also this relationship to the question of the being. So one quick answer is that a scientist will say that when I am experiencing this mug or the weight of the mug, it does not occlude, it does not create an obstacle from me to understand either the other qualities of the mug or, quote unquote, the essence of the mug, or the essence of being is not of concern to them anyway. So that is they may not even think it is worthwhile, not just a scientific question, that is not a question which falls in their domain of facts of the world. But I don't think scientists they don't just look at one aspect of this, of the mug. Tomorrow, if somebody claims within the scientific community that this mug has a consciousness, then all the scientists will sit and keep working on it. In fact, as you know well, when Roger Penrose, a very well-known scientist, a very important theoretical scientist, mathematician, physicist, wrote a very influential piece on theory of consciousness through quantum theory, some microtubules and so on. So he was using quantum theory to model something on consciousness. So as long as you can take the object of inquiry, prepare it in the way it's amenable to scientific intervention according to the rules we have discussed, it is a potential object of science. So, yeah, I think that would be my quick answer to that. Anything else, Ritesh?
I muted myself. Sorry.
Okay, yeah.
There are some string of questions. I'm trying to see if we can draw upon something which are directly in the discussion.
As I said, I will take up all of them in the next one, but yeah.
Yeah. Perhaps, an open question we can take. Is there no concept of a good science, or is it taken for granted that all science is good science?
I know. I think the scientific community will accept. They know what good science and bad science is. They make the judgments all the time. It could be on the type of theories. It could be on the elegance of how some approaches are there being made, elegance of experiments, etc. There are also bad signs in the terms of fraudulent signs, data fudging, and various other aspects which have also been a bit of a problem. But there is a far more stronger patrolling, within the community to make sure that these are very much reduced. So we know about all these questions of plagiarism, data, bad data, people making up data, etc. So I think they accept that is all good signs. But very interestingly, that's an interesting question actually, because interestingly, the meaning of the word bad science is a bad practice of science. They're not saying that it's bad science. They're only saying bad practice. So there, when they use the word science, it's largely a practice, like fudging data, taking somebody else's data, doing various things, or etc., etc. But in principle, if it is, they can say it's interesting science, as long as it follows all the parameters of doing science. Some kind of modeling or some kind of experiment. The concept is using the same concepts and methods as within a particular discipline, then it is science. They may just say it's not very useful science. It is not something for which I'm going to give you a big prize. I'm not going to give you a job because you wrote it. But, they are not going to call it bad science. They may say it's uninteresting science. But when they say bad science, they're really talking about practice. So there they shift to practice. But when they talk about science as such, it is just, as long as you follow the rule following, the conformity within the discourse in various ways, then that is still science. It's uninteresting, not useful. I'm not going to give you a prize for that, but you have every right to do it because that's what doing science is. That's what is in the millions of papers we have been producing now. That's really half of, not half. I must tell you, somebody had also asked about predatory journals. I must mention here that, of all the millions of papers which are published, you ask yourself, how many of them are even cited even once? You would see that the number is a very small fraction. I don't want to give you a number and, shock you about it. But I think it's actually very, very low. In other words, out of the millions of papers which are published, there are millions within it which are never cited, which are never used again in the production of new knowledge. That's what the citation is a marker of that. Many of them are just hidden under this huge collection of original new scientific thought. I am a little more sympathetic to this point, that I think their influence is very different, influences in many other different ways. But it's also true, you have to ask yourself, so much of production is there. It's like having a factory and you're producing millions of some product. And you say, wow, I'm producing so many products, it's so good. But then everything is being dumped in some go down and nobody's using any of your products. How do you understand that kind of a factory? That's what social scientists should be asking. It's not a critique of what they are doing, but it's the social phenomena that we need to understand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think we should close it for the day, because it's 7:30. Yeah.
Okay.
But we'll definitely send the set of questions to you.
Yeah.
And hopefully we'll have some good time to take some of these. There are some interesting string of questions.
Sure, I'll pick them all up. And so on Tuesday, I'll just finish off the last part of the social science, what is special to social science knowledge, and then get on to the next theme on that. Okay. Thanks so much. Thank you all.
Thank you. It's been wonderful.
Thank you. Yeah.
A lot of chat. Yeah. Thank you.